She had 30 seconds before the man with the knife decided she wasn't worth the trouble of keeping alive. The debt collector's blade caught the lamplight inside that rotten store, and every person in Red Mercy looked away. Every single one, because that's what people did in a town built on cowardice. They found something very interesting to stare at on the floor. Every person looked away, except one. A stranger in the back of the store, still as stone, eyes like frozen river water. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but he hadn't looked away either, and that made him the most dangerous man in the room. If this story pulls you in from the very first sentence, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The mountains north of Red Mercy had a name that most people only said once: Black Hollow. Travelers who'd made the mistake of pushing past the last tree line, past the point where the wind stopped sounding like wind and started sounding like something deliberate, came back changed, the ones who came back at all. They talked about the cold up there in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Said it was a different kind of cold, the kind that got inside the chest cavity and just stayed there, like it was deciding something about you. The trappers who worked the lower ridges gave Black Hollow a wide berth. They had families. They had reasons to stay alive. They understood instinctively that some places on Earth are not meant to be inhabited by ordinary men, and that anyone who chose to live up there full-time had either made a terrible mistake or was running from something worse than a mountain. Ronan Vance had been running for 11 years. He came down from the pass twice a year, once before the first hard freeze, once in late spring when the snow softened enough to make the lower trail passable without killing his horse. He didn't look forward to it. He didn't dread it either. He approached the descent the same way he approached everything, with the flat mechanical efficiency of a man who had stripped away every unnecessary feeling and buried the rest so deep it would take a pickaxe to reach them. The horse knew the way. Ronan let it pick its own footing through the rocks and ice while he ran the list through his head. Salt, flour, lamp oil, lead shot, 3 sizes. Percussion caps, 2 tins if Henley's had them. Coffee, if the price was under $1. It wouldn't be, but he'd check. He did not think about the town itself. He did not think about the people. Red Mercy was a transaction, nothing more. You went in, you exchanged what you had for what you needed, you left. The fact that other human beings occupied the same space during that process was an inconvenience he had learned to tolerate, the same way he had learned to tolerate the smell. Red Mercy did smell. Even from a quarter-mile out on the approach, the town announced itself, wood smoke and horse manure, and something chemical from the mines that never fully dissipated, a kind of metallic sourness that coated the back of the throat. Ronan pulled his collar up out of habit, not against the cold. At this elevation in late October, the air coming off the flats was almost warm compared to what he'd left behind, but against the smell of other people's lives pressing in too close. The town had grown since his last visit. Not much, but enough to notice. A new structure going up on the east end, raw lumber yellow against the gray of everything else. Another saloon probably, or another assay office. In Red Mercy, it was usually one or the other. He tied the horse at the rail outside Henley's General, checked the knot twice, not because he didn't trust himself, but because a man alone in the mountains learned that the difference between careful and dead was usually one moment of inattention, and went inside. Henley's General Store smelled like everything that Ronan associated with the worst parts of civilization. Tobacco, cheap tallow candles, the Swedish rod of potatoes kept too long in a barrel, and underneath all of it something damp and fungal that suggested the floorboards had been arguing with the ground moisture for years and losing. The store was not crowded, but it felt crowded. 3 men near the back, playing cards on a barrel that had been converted into a table. A woman with 2 children pressed against the dry goods shelves, pretending very hard to be interested in bolts of cloth. Old Henley himself behind the counter, reading something and deliberately not looking up. And in the center of the room, blocking the main aisle, a man who Ronan clocked as trouble before he'd taken 2 steps through the door. I was thick through the chest, wearing a coat that had been good quality once, but had acquired the particular griminess of a man who slept in it regularly. He had a knife on his belt. Not a working knife, the kind a trapper or a rancher carried for practical purposes, but the kind worn slightly forward, the kind you were supposed to notice. His hat was pushed back on his head in a way that suggested he wanted people to see his face, to see the expression on it. The expression was the problem. It was the look of a man who was enjoying himself. In front of him, backed against the counter with nowhere to go, stood a woman. She was young, mid-20s maybe, though she had the kind of face that made precise age guessing difficult, because whatever softness she'd started with had been worn down to something harder, dark hair coming loose from a knot at the back of her neck. A dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was more patch than cloth. Her hands were flat on the counter behind her, fingers spread, and she was watching the man with the knife with absolutely no expression on her face. That was the thing that stopped Ronan in the doorway. Not the knife, not the obvious threat of the man's posture or the way his hand kept drifting toward the handle just to remind her it was there. What stopped Ronan was the woman's face. No tears, no pleading, no performance of helplessness. Just those flat, cold eyes watching the man in front of her like she was cataloging him, like she was filing information away for later use. "I've told you before, Mrs. Cross." The man's voice was conversational, almost pleasant, which was worse than angry would have been. "Thomas's debt don't disappear just because Thomas did. Widow or not, the obligation transfers. Thomas has been dead 4 months." Her voice was steady. Not brave. Steady. There's a difference. Brave suggests effort. Her steadiness sounded like something that had been burnt down to its foundation and rebuilt with different materials. "I've got no money. I've told you that. You've told me a lot of things." He took a step forward. Not close enough to touch her yet, but close enough that she couldn't move without moving toward him. "Here's what I told the boys over at the Kingfisher. Told them I had a debt to collect. Told them the debtor's widow was a handsome woman with nowhere particular to go." He paused. They seemed interested in a working arrangement. The woman with the children near the dry goods made a small, involuntary sound. Nobody else moved. "My name," the man said, almost gently, "is Silas Grady, and I always collect." Ronan had made it exactly 3 steps into the store before he stopped. He stood there with his rifle slung over his left shoulder and his list in his head, and the very specific awareness that none of this was his business, that he had come down from the mountain for salt and flour and lamp oil, and not for whatever was happening in the middle of this miserable general store, in this miserable town full of people he didn't know and didn't want to know. He looked at the woman. She hadn't looked at him yet. She was still watching Grady. He looked at Henley, who was studying his newspaper with the focused intensity of a man trying to become invisible through sheer concentration. He looked at the 3 card players in the back, who had gone very still and very interested in their hands. He looked at the family near the dry goods, the woman pulling her children in close. Then he looked back at Evelyn Cross. She turned her head then, not toward the door, not toward the card players, not in any of the directions that a frightened person looks when they're searching for help. She turned her head directly toward Ronan, like she'd known he was there the whole time, like she'd been waiting to see what he'd do. Her eyes were brown, dark brown, almost black in the poor lamplight of the store, and the expression in them was not a plea. It wasn't hope. It wasn't even desperation. It was assessment. She was looking at him the same way she'd been looking at Grady, cataloging, filing, deciding. Ronan stood there for exactly 4 seconds. He counted them. He had a habit of counting things when he was deciding whether to do something he knew he shouldn't. Then he crossed the store. "What's the debt?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. 11 years on a mountain with no one to talk to had done something to his voice, stripped it down to just the necessary parts, no more volume than it took to carry meaning across a room. Grady turned slowly, in the theatrical way of a man who doesn't feel the need to hurry because he doesn't perceive threats. He looked Ronan over. The worn coat, the fur hat that was more function than fashion, the rifle, the hands, the face, and appeared to arrive at a comfortable conclusion. "Friend," he said, "this is between me and the widow. Best you mind your own affairs." "I'm asking what the debt is." Grady's eyes narrowed slightly. He recalibrated. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been obvious to someone not watching closely. But Ronan had spent 11 years in a place where misreading an animal, where misreading anything, could end you, and he noticed the tiny shift in Grady's posture. The weight moved back onto his heels, just slightly. $42, Grady said, plus interest, owing from Thomas Cross's loans. The man borrowed from me regular, gambling debts mostly. 42. 42 even, and I'm a fair man, so I haven't added the full interest since. I'll pay it. The store went so quiet, Ronan could hear the lamp above the counter hissing. Grady blinked. It was the blink of a man whose script had just been taken away from him. I beg your pardon? I'll pay the 42. Ronan reached into the interior pocket of his coat and produced a bundle of wrapped furs, beaver pelts, the kind that fetched good prices in the trading post 2 towns over, the kind that represented 3 months of careful trapping in conditions that would hospitalize most men. He set them on the counter. That's worth 60 at current prices. You take the 42 from that and leave the change with Henley. Grady stared at the furs, then at Ronan. You don't even know this woman. No. Then why in them the... Because $42 is $42. Ronan held Grady's gaze. And because I don't like the way this conversation was going. Something moved through Grady's expression then. Not embarrassment, not exactly, but something adjacent to it. The humiliation of a predator being interrupted mid-hunt. His jaw tightened. His hand moved toward the knife handle again, this time less automatically, more deliberate. You're making an error, Grady said quietly. You don't know who I am in this town. I know what you are, Ronan said. Same thing exists in every town, and you know what the furs are worth. Take the money or don't, but you're done here. The silence stretched. The card players in the back had gone so still they weren't even breathing. Then Grady looked at Henley, who was now definitely not reading his newspaper. Looked at the furs on the counter. Did the calculation that men like Grady always did. The one that weighed pride against practicality, revenge against risk, and arrived at whatever decision $42 in certain money makes inevitable. He took the furs. This doesn't end a thing, he said to the room in general, or to Ronan specifically, or to Evelyn Cross. It was hard to tell which. He moved to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. Not a thing. Then he was gone. The lamp kept hissing. Outside, a horse clomped away down the street. Ronan turned to find the woman watching him. I didn't ask for that, she said. No. I wasn't going to let him. I know. He said it simply, without argument. Because he did know. He'd seen it in her face. She'd had a plan of some kind, something beyond just standing there. He didn't know what it was, and it wasn't his business. It's done now. She looked at the counter where the furs had been, then back at him. The assessment was still there in her expression, but it had changed slightly. Less cataloging, more something that might have been the edge of confusion, like he'd introduced a variable she hadn't accounted for. What do you want for it? She asked. Nothing. Men don't spend $60 on nothing. 42, he said. And I just told you what I want for it. Nothing. He turned toward Henley, who had finally put down the newspaper and was watching with the cautious interest of a man who has just witnessed something he'll be describing to people for the next 6 months. I need flour, salt, lamp oil, and percussion caps if you have them. I have them, Henley said, with the slightly dazed cooperation of someone going through the motions while his brain was still catching up to recent events. Ronan nodded and moved toward the shelves. He was halfway through his list, salt located, flour being weighed by Henley's unsteady hands, when he became aware that the woman was still there. Not hovering exactly, but present in his peripheral vision in a way that suggested she was working something out. He kept his back to her and said nothing. Where are you going? She said finally. It wasn't quite a question. Mountains. He picked up a tin of lamp oil and checked the seal. Black Hollow Pass. Tonight? Tomorrow morning. I'll sleep in the stable. He set the oil down and looked at the next item on his mental list. Coffee. He'd said only if the price was under $1. He was going to buy it regardless. He always did. They'll come after me, she said. Probably. Grady doesn't let things go. I know what he is, Ronan said again. I've got nowhere. She said it flat, without self-pity, like she was reciting something factual. Thomas's brother wants the house. Town constable answers to the mine company, and the mine company answers to whoever pays them. I've got $6 in a tin under the floorboard, and nothing else. Ronan stood at the shelf with his hand on a bag of coffee beans and stared at the wall of merchandise in front of him for a moment. Then he turned around. She hadn't moved. She was standing with her arms at her sides, not crossed, not wringing her hands, just standing there in that exhausted dress with those dark cataloging eyes, waiting. I live alone, he said. Up on the ridge, there's a cabin. He stopped. He hadn't planned this. He had not planned any of this. It's not comfortable. It's cold. It's a long way from anything. And He stopped again, more aware than he wanted to be of how long it had been since he'd explained himself to anyone. I don't know you. No, she said, and I'm not in the habit of. No, I understand that. It would be. He tried to find the right word and settled for honest. Hard. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, exactly, but something that wasn't purely calculation either. I know hard, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. The horse leaves at first light, he said. Stables on the south end of town. If you're there, you're there. If you're not, he picked up the coffee. Then you're not. He set it on Henley's counter and went back to his list. She was there. He arrived at the stable at 6 in the morning, an hour before first light by his reckoning, expecting to hitch the horse and leave. Expecting, in some part of himself that he wasn't prepared to examine, the relief of being alone again. She was sitting on a fence post outside the stable door, with a canvas bag at her feet and a rifle across her knees. A beat-up Winchester repeater with a scratched stock that had seen better years. She was wearing a coat over her dress now, a man's coat too big for her shoulders, and she had braided her hair and tucked it under a hat. He stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything. The Winchester wasn't a display. She wasn't holding it to make a point, or because she thought it made her look capable. She was holding it the way people hold tools they're accustomed to, without particular thought for it, just in the hand, because that's where useful things go when you might need them. Is that loaded? He asked. It wouldn't be much use if it wasn't. He considered that. Can you ride? Not well, she said. I can stay on. That's what I can promise. He nodded once and went into the stable to get his horse. They were out of Red Mercy before the town's one rooster had finished its first complaint of the morning. The trail into the mountains was not a trail exactly. It was more like a series of suggestions, places where the rock was slightly less impassable than other places, where a person who knew what they were doing could negotiate the terrain without killing themselves or their horse. Ronan knew what he was doing. He had been making this particular ascent for 11 years, in every season, in conditions that ranged from merely brutal to genuinely dangerous, and his body had absorbed the knowledge of it the way bodies absorb all essential knowledge, without conscious thought, through pure repetition. Evelyn did not know what she was doing. She did not pretend that she did, which was the thing that, grudgingly, against his better judgment, Ronan found himself respecting. When the trail narrowed to a ledge above a 30-foot drop, and her horse balked and skittered sideways toward the edge, she didn't panic and she didn't pretend she wasn't scared. She just said, quietly and precisely, "Tell me what to do." He told her. She did it. The horse moved back onto the trail. They kept going. They were above the tree line by midday, moving through a landscape that had shed every concession to comfort and become purely functional, gray rock and brown scrub, and above them, the permanent white of the upper snowfields catching the flat October light. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in the space of an hour. He heard her breathing change. You need to tell me if you can't feel your hands, he said, without looking back. I can feel them. That can stop without warning up here. If they go numb, I'll tell you. He wasn't sure he believed her, but there was nothing he could do about it until she either told him or fell off her horse, so he kept riding. The silence between them on that first long climb was not comfortable. But it was not hostile. It was the silence of two people who understood, without having discussed it, that words cost energy, and energy was currently a resource that neither of them could spare. She asked one question somewhere in the middle of the afternoon when the wind had come up from the east and they were moving through it at an angle that required physical effort just to maintain direction. How long does this take? Another 4 hours, he said. She didn't answer. He looked back once, briefly. She had her chin down into the collar of her coat, and she was riding. They arrived at the cabin at dusk. He watched her look at it. He'd become so accustomed to the place that he'd mostly stopped seeing it the way a person who hadn't lived there would see it. But watching Evelyn Cross stand in the last gray light of the evening and take in his home, he found himself involuntarily aware of what it looked like from outside. Small. Very small. Built into the side of the ridge so that the back wall was the mountain itself, which had solved certain structural problems, but had created the permanent impression that the cabin was being slowly absorbed into the rock. The roof had 2 decades of living moss on it, which actually improved the insulation, but didn't improve the aesthetics. One window, north-facing because that had been the only direction available, covered with oiled paper rather than glass, because glass was $17 a pane and he had better uses for $17. The door fit reasonably well. He'd spent a whole autumn 3 years ago rehanging it and filling the gaps. But the overall impression was of a structure that had survived not through quality, but through sheer stubbornness. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You live here," she said. "Yes." She looked back at the cabin. "Alone?" "Yes." She nodded, once, slowly, the nod of a person recalibrating expectations. "All right," she said, and picked up her bag and walked toward the door. He stood there a moment longer than necessary. All right. Not what he'd expected. No obvious horror, no second-guessing, no outward doubt. Just, all right. As if the cabin were simply the next fact in an ongoing series of facts to be dealt with. He followed her inside. The interior of the cabin was one room, with a wood stove that was the single most important object in his life, and a sleeping platform built against the east wall, and a work table, and 2 shelves of supplies, and currently the smell of 11 months of one person's occupation, pine smoke, and dried meat, and something Ronan couldn't smell anymore but assumed must be present because he'd smelled it in other people's one-room dwellings. He lit the stove while she stood in the middle of the room, still wearing her coat, looking at the space with the same methodical assessment she seemed to apply to everything. "Where do I sleep?" she asked. He gestured toward the sleeping platform. "You can have that. I'll—" He looked around the cabin as if a solution might present itself. There wasn't one. The floor was dirt. "I'll manage." "That's a kind offer, but I'm not taking your bed." She set her bag down. "I'll make something. Is there material?" "There's blankets in that chest." "And boards?" "There's timber under the lean-to outside." "Then I'll make something." She said it with the practicality of someone who had been making do with available materials their whole life. "Show me where the woodpile is." He showed her. Then he stood back and watched, because he didn't know what else to do, while this woman he'd known for 12 hours moved around his cabin and began doing things. It felt strange. Not wrong, exactly. Strange. Like his eyes were having trouble processing the information they were receiving. The presence of another person moving through his space, touching his things, making sounds that weren't him or the wind or the mountain. He sat at the work table and started stripping a piece of leather that needed work and told himself it was fine. The stove popped and settled. Outside, the first real wind of evening came down off the upper ridge, hit the cabin walls, and went somewhere else. The oiled paper in the window shivered once and went still. Inside, Evelyn Cross found a pot and some dried beans in the second shelf and, without asking, started cooking. Dinner was beans and dried venison and coffee, eaten at the work table with enough room between them that neither person had to be conscious of the other's elbows. She'd made the coffee slightly too strong by his standard, which was not a complaint he was going to make under any circumstances. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "On the mountain." He considered. 11 years. She looked up from her bowl. Something moved through her expression that wasn't quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. Before that? Different place. He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask for it, which he noted. "I've never been above the lower trail," she said. "Never thought—" She stopped. Thomas talked about going up there once. Hunting trip. Denny Hartley told him there were elk up past the snow line that were the size of horses. She picked up her coffee. He never went. Ronan didn't ask about Thomas. He had the shape of Thomas Cross already. The gambling debts, the borrowed money, the young wife left in a bad situation, and more information wasn't going to change what he could see. "You're from Red Mercy?" he asked. "Originally from Callowgate, a town he'd heard of. Small, agricultural, 2 days southeast. My father had a farm there. He died when I was 19. I had 2 options after that." She said it without bitterness, which was more disturbing than bitterness would have been. "I made a choice. Some choices look different later than they did at the time." "Yes," he said. She looked at him across the table. "You understand that," she said. It wasn't a question. He drank his coffee and didn't answer. They finished dinner without speaking. She cleaned the pot. He banked the stove for the night. They both got ready for bed in the careful, studied nonchalance of 2 people who are sharing a 12-foot by 14-foot space for the first time and are working very hard not to make that uncomfortable. She had indeed found boards in the lean-to and had constructed, in the time between his getting the stove going and dinner being ready, a low wooden frame on the opposite side of the cabin from his sleeping platform, padded with 2 folded blankets. It was not comfortable by any standard. It was functional. He lay on his platform in the dark, and listened to the wind work its way around the roof. "You're going to be cold," he said, mostly because it was true, and he hadn't figured out how to not say true things. A pause. "I'm cold now. There's another blanket in the chest." "I know, I already took it." He closed his eyes. "Ronan." Her voice was quiet. Not sleepy, just quiet. "Why did you do it?" "In the store." He thought about it, not performing thought, actually thinking, because he wasn't sure he had a clean answer. "I don't know," he said, which was the most honest thing he could offer. Silence. "All right," she said. The wind did its thing. The stove ticked as the metal settled. Somewhere above them, the mountain made a sound like a very deep exhale, the way mountains do when the temperature drops fast. Some combination of rock contraction and snowpack shifting and the general indifference of enormous geological formations to the concerns of the things living on them. Evelyn Cross and Ronan Vance lay awake in the dark for a long time on opposite sides of a cabin that had never held two people before, each of them thinking things they wouldn't have been able to easily articulate. And outside the single north-facing window, the first snow of the season began to fall without warning or ceremony. It fell the way most important things begin, quietly, without asking. The snow that started falling on their first night didn't stop for 4 days. Ronan woke before dawn on the second morning to find 8 inches on the ground and more coming down in the flat, purposeful way that meant the storm hadn't decided anything yet. He dressed in the dark without making noise, a habit from years of solitary mornings, and got the stove going before he registered that Evelyn was already awake. She was sitting on her wooden frame with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the window, which had gone from dark to the particular blue-gray of snowlight. "How long does it usually last?" she asked. Her voice had the texture of someone who hadn't slept well but wasn't going to mention it. "Can't say. Could clear by tonight. Could go a week." He opened the stove and fed it 2 pieces of split pine. "This one feels like it wants to stay a while." She accepted that without visible distress, which he was starting to understand was simply how she processed information. Absorb it, file it, figure out what it changes. No performance of feeling, just the feeling itself, kept internal and worked over privately. What he had not expected in any of the calculations he'd made during that first night awake was that she would be useful. Not useful in the way of someone trying to justify their presence, working hard and visibly to prove they deserved the space they were occupying. That kind of performative effort had its own exhausting energy, and he'd seen it before in men who came up to the mountain thinking they wanted to trap and discovered 3 weeks in that they were actually terrified of silence. Evelyn didn't work like that. She worked the way he worked, because things needed doing, and someone had to do them. And standing around thinking about whether or not you wanted to do them was a waste of time that the mountain didn't allow. On the second day, without being asked, she hauled in 2 loads of firewood from the lean-to while he was working on a piece of harness leather that needed replacing. He heard her make 3 trips, heard the snow squeak under her boots, heard the lean-to door scrape, and then the cabin door and the thud of wood being stacked. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The wood pile next to the stove got taller. On the 3rd day, she found the grain sacks that he'd been meaning to restitch since August, and did it, using the heavy needle and wax thread from his repair kit, her stitches neat and close in a way that suggested she'd done this kind of work before. Not something he expected from a woman who'd grown up on a Callowgate farm, then immediately understood why he shouldn't be surprised by it. The snow kept coming. By the 4th day, the drifts against the north wall were nearly to the window. The wind had found a new frequency, lower, more sustained, the kind of sound that worked its way into the back of the skull and sat there. They were burning through wood faster than he liked. He'd laid in a good supply, more than enough for one person through the worst of the season, but the math changed with 2 bodies in the space, 2 people needing the stove to run hotter, longer. I was doing the calculation in his head, quietly, when she said, "You're counting the wood." He looked at her across the cabin. She was mending one of his wool shirts, a task she'd started an hour ago, after finding a pile of them in the chest with various tiers that had been accumulating since last spring. "You were looking at the pile the same way you look at the supply shelf," she said, "like you're running numbers." "I was." "What are the numbers?" "We're fine," he said. It was almost true. "I'll go out tomorrow if the storm breaks and cut more." She went back to the shirt. He watched her hands work for a moment, not staring, just noticing, and then looked away. "Where'd you learn to mend like that?" he asked. My mother, mostly. And then necessity. She pulled the thread through. Thomas wasn't hard on clothes, but he wasn't gentle with them either. And we couldn't afford the seamstress. A beat. We couldn't afford most things by the end. He almost didn't ask. He had a long practice of not asking personal questions because personal questions invited reciprocal ones. But the storm outside had created a particular kind of enforced intimacy. There was nowhere to go, nothing to look at, except the four walls and each other, no task that required his complete and total attention at this exact moment, so he asked, "How long were you married?" 3 years. She bit the thread. The first year was all right. She paused, not for drama, just arranging words. He was a man with enthusiasms, big ideas. He'd come in from the saloon convinced he'd found the solution to everything, some scheme involving the mines, or a cattle deal, or a game of cards that had gone particularly well. He was a good talker. When things were going well, he was easy to be around. Another pause. Things didn't go well for long. And then Grady. Grady was the last in a long line of men Thomas borrowed from. The others some of them were reasonable. Some of them understood that a dead man can't pay back a debt. She folded the shirt across her knee and smoothed it flat. Grady wasn't interested in reasonable. Ronan nodded. You didn't like him, she said. In the store. You knew what he was the second you walked in. I've met that kind before. Most men in that store had also met that kind before. They stayed out of it. He didn't have a clean answer for that, so he didn't offer one. The storm broke late that afternoon. The wind dropped first, in the abrupt way of mountain weather that suggests a decision has been made somewhere above the clouds, and then the snow thinned from a curtain to a scatter to a few isolated flakes drifting down in the windless air. By evening, the sky had opened in the west to a band of cold orange light, and the world outside the cabin window was impossibly white and still. He went out to cut wood the next morning. She came with him. He didn't ask her to. She simply appeared at the door in her coat and hat, picked up one of the 2 hatchets leaning against the cabin wall, and waited. He looked at the hatchet in her hand. She looked back at him. You know how to use that? He asked. Point it at the wood. Hit the wood. That's the principle, isn't it? More or less. He picked up the axe and started for the tree line. She was not efficient with the hatchet at first. The technique was wrong. Too much arm, not enough shoulder, chopping at an angle that bounced more than it bit. He watched her attempt the same branch 3 times, each time with a slightly different angle and a slightly different result, none of them good. Your wrist is breaking, he said. She stopped and looked at him. When you swing, your wrist turns. Keep it locked. She tried again. Better. Not good, but better. She looked at the result, then at him. Again, she said. He showed her twice on his own piece of wood, the motion reduced to its components. She watched carefully, the way she watched everything. Complete attention, nothing wasted. Then she tried again. By the time they'd worked through an hour, she had half a stack cut. Her shoulder was clearly hurting her. He could see it in the slight forward hunch when she brought the hatchet back. But she didn't mention it, and he didn't point it out. They carried the wood back in 2 trips, stacking it against the lean-to wall where the roof overhang would keep the snow off. Her breath came in white clouds in the cold air, and her cheeks were raw. She didn't complain about any of it. Your shoulder, he said, as they finished the second stack. It's fine. It's not. You're favoring it. She turned and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been managing their own physical condition for long enough that outside observation feels slightly intrusive. I know, she said. It'll work itself out. There's liniment inside. I know that too. I found it on the second shelf. She picked up the empty carry rope. Thank you. It was the first time she'd thanked him for anything since the store. He didn't know what to do with it, so he held the cabin door and went in after her. The days developed a rhythm, the way days do when the alternatives are chaos or routine, and you're practical enough to choose routine. Mornings were wood and water. The creek below the cabin froze over in the nights, but broke loose with enough persuasion, and hauling water up the slope was the first task regardless of weather. Evelyn took the water hauling without discussing it. He took the trap lines, which required moving through the upper terrain in conditions she hadn't built the specific physical knowledge for yet. They cooked together in the evenings, or rather they occupied the same space while food got made, dividing the tasks without assigning them through some negotiation that happened entirely in gesture and proximity. She was a better cook than him. This was not a high bar. His approach to cooking was fundamentally about caloric content and available materials, and had nothing to do with whether the result tasted like anything in particular. Her approach was not elaborate, but it had something his lacked: attention. She paid attention to what was in the pot. She adjusted things. The beans tasted different than when he made beans, and he was not going to say this out loud, but he noticed it. What surprised him most was the quiet. Not the absence of noise. The mountain was never truly quiet. There was always wind, or the creak of frozen wood, or the sound of the stove. But the quality of the silence between them. He'd lived alone for so long that he'd forgotten silence could be something other than solitary. This silence was different. Shared silence, which was a thing he hadn't experienced in a very long time, and which felt strange in his chest in a way he found difficult to categorize. He didn't examine it. He'd learned not to examine things that didn't require immediate examination. The incident happened 3 weeks into her time on the ridge, on a morning when the temperature had dropped below what his rudimentary outdoor thermometer could read, and the sky was the flat white of a storm building from the northwest. He'd gone to check the far trap line, further than he usually went in weather threatening, but the beaver traps in the upper creek hadn't been checked in 4 days, and leaving trapped animals in the cold for too long created problems he didn't want to deal with. He told her that morning he'd be back by midday. It was a reasonable estimate based on the conditions at departure. The conditions changed. The storm came in faster than he'd read it. By the time he'd reached the upper creek and dealt with the traps and started back, the wind had come up hard from the northwest, and the visibility had dropped to 30 feet, then 20, then less. He knew the terrain well enough to navigate it in bad conditions, had done it dozens of times. But this was the particular combination of factors: cold, wind, low visibility, and the fatigue that comes from moving through deep snow for 4 hours, that the mountain occasionally used to remind him that familiarity was not the same as safety. He found the tree line. He knew the direction. He kept moving. The cold was the problem. Not gradually. It had crossed a threshold somewhere in the last hour and become the aggressive kind, the kind that started negotiating with the body's core temperature and didn't negotiate in good faith. His hands were functioning, but the fingers had gone from cold to numb to something past numb, that he recognized as a warning he'd been ignoring. He'd had frostbite before, twice in his early years on the mountain before he'd learned to read the signs, and he knew the progression. I was moving too slowly. He knew he was moving too slowly. The snow in the open area between the trees and the cabin was hip-deep in places where the wind had pushed it, and crossing it was less like walking and more like a slow, exhausting negotiation with gravity. He was 70 yards from the cabin when his legs gave, not dramatically. Just stopped being reliable. He went down on one knee and stayed there for a moment, and the part of his brain that remained operational knew that staying there was not an option, but also that getting up required a certain amount of will that was currently in shorter supply than he'd like. The cabin door opened. She'd been watching for him. He realized this later, that she'd been watching from the window for the last hour, that when the storm came in, she'd understood the problem and had stood at that oiled paper window in the gray light, tracking the shapes in the snow and waiting. She came out of the cabin without a coat, which was stupid, which he would tell her later, and crossed the yard in 6 running strides and got her shoulder under his arm. "Up," she said. "Come on." "I'm up, Ronan." Her voice was the same flat, functional tone she used for everything. No panic in it, no elevated emotion, just the voice of someone who had decided what needed to happen and was making it happen. "We're 20 feet from the door. Up." He got up. They covered the 20 feet. The cabin door. Inside. The heat from the stove hit him like a physical impact. She sat him down on the sleeping platform and looked at his hands and said something under her breath that he didn't catch. She went to the stove and poured hot water into the basin. Not boiling, she'd already understood that, and put his hands in it and held them there with both of hers. "Don't," she said when he started to pull back. "Leave them." "It's fine. I know you've had frostbite before. I can see the scars." She kept hold of his hands. "Leave them in the water." He left them in the water. The feeling came back in stages, each stage more unpleasant than the last. The way feeling always returns to cold extremities, burning first, then the deep ache, then finally something that was merely uncomfortable. She didn't let go until both hands were moving freely. "Your coat was soaked through," she said, refilling the basin with water from the pot on the stove. "You need to get out of it. I know how to manage cold exposure. You were on your knees in the snow when I got to you." He didn't have an answer for that. "Coat off," she said. "And the shirt under it, it's wet." He took the coat off. She took it from him and hung it near the stove, then turned back and looked at him with the same practical assessment she'd been applying to him since the general store. He took the shirt off. She found the spare wool blanket from the chest and handed it over without comment. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform wrapped in the blanket while she remade the fire and checked the stove and moved around the cabin with the quiet efficiency that had become, without him noticing the exact moment it happened, simply part of how the cabin functioned. "I miscalculated the storm," he said. "Yes. It came in faster than—" "Ronan." She didn't look at him. She was feeding the stove. "You don't have to explain it to me. You were wrong about the timing and the mountain nearly killed you. Now you're inside. That's all that matters right now." He sat with that for a moment. The fire built up behind the stove grate. The cabin began, slowly, to reclaim the temperature that the open door had cost it. His hands had graduated from aching to merely sore, which was progress. "Thank you," he said. She closed the stove door and looked at him. The expression on her face was something he couldn't fully read. Not the cataloging look, not the flat practicality. Something more complicated than either of those. Something that had been there in brief flashes before, but that the events of the last hour had brought closer to the surface. "Don't do it again," she said. He nodded. She went back to the work table and picked up whatever task she'd put down when she'd seen him through the window. He sat on the sleeping platform in the blanket and watched the stove glow and understood, with the particular clarity that near misses provide, that the last 11 years had reorganized themselves into before and after without his permission. Before the woman in the general store with the flat dark eyes who wasn't afraid of Silas Grady. After the moment she'd come out of that cabin door into the storm without a coat, already moving, already decided. He didn't know what to do with that understanding, so he did what he always did with things that didn't require immediate action. He filed it and let the warmth from the stove do its work. The hands healed slowly. That was the honest version of it. Ronan told himself they were fine within 3 days, resumed the trap lines on the 4th, and said nothing when the cold made the scarred knuckles stiffen in ways they hadn't before. Evelyn watched him flex his fingers at the work table each morning without commenting on it, which he appreciated more than he would have been able to explain. She had developed in the weeks since the storm an instinct for the precise boundary between concern and intrusion. She noticed things, filed them, acted when action was required, and otherwise stayed on her side of the line. It was a quality he hadn't known to look for in a person and now couldn't imagine being without. January came down off the upper ridge like something that had been saving itself. Not the casual cold of November or the steady grinding cold of December, but the specific, committed cold of deep winter in the Black Hollow Range, the kind that got into the cabin walls overnight and made the morning fire feel like an argument rather than a solution. The water pail nearest the door froze solid by midnight, regardless of how well the stove was banked. Ice formed on the inside of the window, thick enough that you had to scrape it with a knife to see through the oiled paper. They were burning wood at a rate that made Ronan do the mental math repeatedly, hoping the numbers would change. They didn't change. He cut more when weather allowed, which was not always. Evelyn cut alongside him every time, her technique with the hatchet, now functional, if not elegant. She still favored the right shoulder from whatever she'd done to it in the first weeks, and the cold made it worse, but she'd found a compensating rhythm that got the work done. The food situation was more concerning than the wood. He hadn't laid in for 2 people. The mathematics of it were straightforward and unwelcome. His usual winter stores, calculated for 1 person through April, were being consumed by 2. He stretched it where he could, rationed things she didn't know he was rationing, ate less himself without making it visible. She was already doing the same thing. He could tell by the way she served her own portions, careful, calibrated, slightly less than what her body was probably asking for, and said nothing about it. They didn't discuss the food directly. They didn't need to. They both understood the situation, and neither of them was going to make the other feel worse about it by naming it out loud. What they did was trap harder. He extended the lines further than he typically would in January, pushing into terrain that was less reliable but more productive. She came with him twice when the weather allowed, learning the routes, learning which sets were his best producers and which were maintenance traps that rarely yielded anything but had to be checked anyway. She was good in the field in a way that still surprised him periodically. Quiet when quiet was necessary, observant, asking questions that suggested she was thinking about the whole system rather than just the immediate task. "Why do you put these ones here?" she asked one morning, crouching in the snow beside a set along the upper creek bank. "The snow's shallower here. The animal would see it easier." "Look at the bank," he said. She looked. "Slide marks," she said after a moment. "They come down here regular. Every 3-4 days, that bank is their path." He reset the trigger with 2 careful fingers. "You don't put the trap where you want to catch them. You put it where they already are." She was quiet for a moment, thinking this over. "That works for people too," she said. He glanced at her. "Grady," she said. He found the places Thomas already was. The saloon. The card tables. He didn't create the problem. He just put himself in the path of it. She stood and brushed snow from her knees. "Doesn't make him less of what he is." "No," Ronan said. They didn't talk about Grady often, but when the subject came up, it arrived with a specific weight, the awareness, which neither of them mentioned but both carried, that the snow wouldn't last forever. That come spring, when the pass opened, the conversation that had been interrupted in Henley's general store would eventually resume. What form it would take was unclear. That it would take some form was not. He brought it up one night in late January because he'd been not bringing it up for 2 months, and the weight of the avoidance had become heavier than the conversation itself. "In the spring," he said. She looked up from the shirt she was mending. Always mending. The irony of spending the winter repairing a dead man's shirts was not lost on either of them, but the shirts were warm and practical, and sentiment was a luxury the mountain didn't accommodate. "He'll come," Ronan said. "I know. He's not the kind of man who lets $42 rewrite his plans. The money was—" He stopped. "The money was a postponement, not a resolution." She set the shirt down. "I know that too. And he won't come alone." She looked at him steadily. "I figured that. So we need to be ready." He leaned forward, elbows on the work table. "I have the rifle. I have the revolver. And I can show you. I know how to shoot," she said. "You know how to point a rifle and pull the trigger? I grew up on a farm. My father hunted. He didn't see the sense in a daughter who couldn't handle herself in the field." A pause. "I'm not good at it, but I'm not useless." "The revolver's different from a rifle," he said. "Heavier, more recoil, and if it comes to it, you'll be closer to the problem than you'd want to be with a rifle." She absorbed that. "Show me the revolver." He got it from the chest where he kept it. A cavalry model, .44 caliber, black iron and walnut grip, the kind of weapon designed specifically to function in the hands of a person who was frightened and cold, and doing several other things at the same time. He set it on the table between them. She picked it up immediately, turned it over. Her hands were not large, but they were not small either. Hands that had been reshaped by months of mountain work. The kind of hands that held things well now. "It's heavier than I thought," she said. "Yes. And it kicks. It'll move you. You need to know that going in, because if you're surprised by it, the second shot won't go where you want it." He watched her hold it. "Grip higher on the handle. Higher. There. Now your thumb isn't in the way of the cylinder." She adjusted. "Good." He reached across and touched her wrist briefly, repositioning the angle. Wrist locked. Same principle as the hatchet. She looked at him. Something almost like dry humor moved through her expression. "Everything is the same principle as the hatchet." "More or less," he said. They practiced in this clearing behind the cabin on mornings when the weather was manageable, which in January meant mornings when it was merely bitter rather than actively trying to kill them. He set up marks on a fence post and a section of bark propped against the woodpile and let her find her own relationship with the weapon, watching for the errors without rushing to correct them. She needed to discover certain things herself, because knowledge that comes from your own body sticks differently than knowledge you're told. The first shot went wide by 4 feet and the recoil sat her back on her heels. She said nothing, just looked at where the shot had gone, looked at the revolver, looked at him. "Again," she said. It was always again with her. He'd noticed this early, and it hadn't changed. She didn't waste time being discouraged, didn't perform frustration, just recalibrated and tried again. It was, he thought, probably how she'd survived Thomas Cross and Silas Grady and Red Mercy and the first weeks on the mountain, not by being exceptional, but by refusing to stop. By the 3rd morning of practice, her groupings were beginning to mean something. Not tight, not accurate in the way of someone trained, but intentional. There was thought behind each shot now, not just hope. "Your shoulder," he said, the 3rd morning. "It's fine." It's not fine, you hiss every time the gun comes back. She looked at him, caught. The expression was briefly, uncharacteristically unguarded. Not embarrassment exactly, but the look of someone who has been working hard at not being seen and has been seen anyway. She recovered quickly. It's manageable, she said, with more precision. Let me look at it. Ronan, you need both arms working. Let me look. A pause. Then she pulled the collar of her coat aside and worked the shoulder free. He'd expected a muscle problem, something from the woodcutting in the early weeks. What he found was older than that. A joint that had been damaged before she came to the mountain, healed crooked, and was now being asked to absorb the recoil of a .44 caliber revolver on a daily basis. How? He said. She pulled the coat back up. It doesn't matter. It was deliberate. He didn't make it a question because he could see that it was, and asking her to confirm it would just make it harder. She was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the clearing and pulled at the loose strands of her hair. The second year, she said finally. When Thomas started losing more than winning, She stopped. He was sorry after. He was always sorry after. Ronan didn't say anything, because everything he was capable of saying felt inadequate in the specific way that true things sometimes are. It healed wrong, she said. I didn't have the money to see a doctor, and by the time I had enough it had already... She stopped again. I manage it. I know you manage it. He picked the revolver up from where she'd set it on the fence post. We adjust how you hold it. Bring the grip down slightly. It won't be as stable, but it'll distribute the recoil away from the joint. He demonstrated. Like this. She looked at the grip position for a moment. Then she took the revolver back and tried it. Better? He asked. Better, she said. They kept practicing. There were nights in February when the nightmares were bad. His or hers. The distinction was less clear than it should have been, because in a one-room cabin, what one person experiences in sleep becomes part of the other person's night, whether they want it to or not. He'd been having some version of the same dream for 11 years. Variations on the same event, the same faces, the same specific moment that had sent him up into the Black Hollow range in the first place. He didn't know what she dreamed. He knew the sound of her waking from it, a sharp, indrawn breath, followed by silence, followed by the careful movements of a person who had woken suddenly and was orienting themselves quickly, making sure of their location. One night in the third week of February, when the temperature outside had been below zero for 6 straight days, and the cabin was doing its best against it, he woke at 2 in the morning to find her sitting up on her sleeping frame with her arms around her knees. He watched her for a moment in the dark. You don't have to pretend, he said. She looked over at him. In the faint glow from the stove grate, her face was mostly shadow. You wake up like something's still in the room with you, he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, Does that go away? He thought about 11 years of the same dream in different forms. It changes, he said, which was honest, if incomplete. She rested her chin on her knees. The stove clicked. Outside, the wind was doing its patient work against the roof. The night he died, she said, Thomas, I was relieved. She said it flat, like a confession that had been waiting a long time for the right darkness to be set in. Not glad. I wasn't glad, but relieved. And then I spent the next 4 months feeling like a terrible person for that. You weren't, he said. I know that. A pause. Most of the time I know that. She looked at the stove grate. Some nights I forget. He didn't offer comfort, because she wasn't asking for comfort. She was asking for witness, just for someone to hear it said out loud, which was different. He understood that. He'd had things himself that needed to be said out loud in the dark before they'd stop being so loud inside. I had a partner, he said. It came out of him with less resistance than he expected, which surprised him. 11 years ago, before the mountain. He looked at the ceiling. His name was Cal. We were trapping together in the lower range, the first season I came up this way. There was an accident, the kind that happens fast. He stopped. The kind you spend years afterward finding different versions of, trying to construct the one where you made a different choice, and it came out different. She had turned to look at him fully now. It doesn't come out different, he said. I know that. I've known it for years. But knowing a thing and believing it all the way down are... He stopped again. Not the same thing, she said quietly. No. The stove glowed. The wind pushed at the north wall and found no new way in. Outside, the mountain did what it always did. endured, and asked nothing of anyone, and waited. Eventually she lay back down. He lay back down. Neither of them slept immediately, but the quality of the wakefulness had changed, less pressurized, like something had been let out of a closed space and had dissipated into the cold air where it couldn't concentrate and become unbearable. By March, the revolver shooting had become something else. Still practice, technically. They were still working through the fundamentals, still running through the drills he'd designed around the specific scenario of men coming up the trail from the pass. But there was a competence in her hands now that hadn't been there in January. The shoulder adapted or accepted or arrived at some working compromise with the situation. Her groupings on the bark target were consistent enough to mean something real. One afternoon, late in March, she put 3 shots inside a handspan group at 40 feet and lowered the revolver and looked at him. He looked back at her. "Is that good enough?" she asked. He thought about Silas Grady, about the 2 men Grady had brought to the store, about the specific distance between the cabin door and the place where a man coming up the trail would be when he first came into view. "Yes," he said, "that's enough." She nodded once, checked the cylinder the way he'd taught her, methodically, 1 chamber at a time, loaded it back, held it with the barrel down at her side, the way she held it now when she wasn't actively shooting. Not careless, just at rest. He looked at her standing there in the thin March light, with the revolver in her hand and the mountain at her back, and thought that a person who had seen her in that general store in October, backed against a counter, nowhere to go, everything stacked against her, would not recognize her as the same person. The frame was the same. The dark eyes, the set of the jaw, the quality of stillness. But something in the interior architecture had shifted. Or hadn't shifted, maybe. Maybe it had always been there, and the mountain had just stripped away everything that had been covering it. He didn't say any of this. He was not built for that kind of speech, and she would have found it embarrassing anyway. "Snow's breaking up on the lower trail," he said instead. She looked south, toward the pass, as if she could see through the ridge to the road below. "When?" 3-4 weeks. Maybe less if the temperature keeps. She didn't answer. She was looking at the horizon with the same flat assessment she turned on everything, cataloging, filing, deciding. Then she turned away from the pass and walked back toward the cabin, and he followed her inside, and neither of them said another word about what was coming. There was nothing useful left to say about it. They'd done the work, they'd made the preparations. What was going to happen was going to happen, and they would face it from the same ground they'd been standing on all winter. That was all there was. On the mountain, that was enough. The snow didn't melt so much as surrender. It happened in stages across the first 2 weeks of April, the upper snowfields pulling back from the rock faces, the creek below the cabin waking up loud and aggressive after 5 months of silence, the lower trail becoming visible again in pieces, a dark thread of mud and exposed stone reappearing through the white. The world smelled different. Ronan noticed it every spring, but this year it hit him differently. The smell of thaw, of wet earth, and pine resin, and the particular mineral sharpness of snowmelt running over rock. Life reasserting itself whether or not anyone was ready for it. He and Evelyn both noticed the trail on the same morning. They were outside doing separate tasks. He was checking the lean-to roof for winter damage. She was hauling water from the creek. When she stopped at the top of the slope and looked south without saying anything. He looked where she was looking. The pass trail was visible for the first time since October, a thin dark line working its way up through the rock and scrub. Neither of them commented on it. They went back to what they were doing. But that evening, after dinner, Ronan moved the rifle from its place on the wall pegs and set it on the work table and checked it completely. Every part, every mechanism, the barrel swabbed and examined, the action cycled until he was satisfied with each component individually and the whole thing together. Evelyn watched from across the table without being asked to. When he finished with the rifle, he got the revolver from the chest and went through the same process. She said, "How many rounds do you have?" "For the rifle, 63. For the revolver, 41. She did the math. "That's more than enough for 3 men. It's enough if the shooting is accurate and the situation is straightforward." He set the revolver down. "Situations aren't always straightforward. What do we do if there are more than 3? He looked at her. "Do you think there will be?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Grady has money, or had money. He moves in a certain kind of company. The question is whether this is personal enough to him to bring serious men, or whether it's just business, in which case he'd bring whoever was cheap and available. A pause. He looked at me like it was personal. Yes, Ronan said. He did. He'd been thinking about this since March, turning the variables over, trying to construct the most likely version of what April would bring. Grady was not a stupid man. That was the difficulty. Stupid men were predictable. Grady was calculating, and the calculation he'd been running since October had had all winter to compound. The humiliation of the general store, the $42 that had been more than money, it had been a public demonstration that Silas Grady could be stopped. Men like Grady could not absorb that kind of thing without a response. It wasn't pride in the simple sense. It was the structural necessity of what he was. Let one debt go answered, and every other debtor in Red Mercy would know about it by the following week. So he would come. The only real question was when. The answer came on a Tuesday morning, 10 days into April, when the trail mud had begun to firm up enough for horses, and the sky was a hard, clear blue that had no warmth in it yet. Ronan was outside splitting wood when he heard it, the specific, intermittent sound of hooves on wet rock moving uphill. He'd been listening for it for 2 weeks. He recognized it immediately. He set the axe down carefully, not dropping it, and went to the cabin door. Inside, he said. She was at the table. She looked at his face and didn't ask questions. She stood and picked up the revolver from the shelf where it had been sitting loaded for the past 10 days, checked the cylinder, force of habit now, automatic, and moved toward the window. How many? She asked. Can't tell yet, at least 2 horses. He took the rifle from the wall. Stay back from the window. If they don't see you in the yard, they'll have to come to the door. That's worse. I know, but it narrows the angles. He pushed 2 extra rounds into his coat pocket and looked at her. You know what we discussed. If you go down, if I'm not on my feet, you don't wait to see what happens next. She held his gaze for a moment. Her jaw was set, and her hands on the revolver were not shaking, not yet, and her eyes had the focused, emptied quality of someone who has arranged themselves for something difficult and is holding that arrangement through pure deliberate effort. He recognized it because he'd felt it himself. That specific internal stillness that isn't calm, but functions like calm. Don't go down, she said. He went outside. They came up the trail in the way that overconfident men come into uncertain territory. Not cautiously, not with any particular tactical intelligence, but with the momentum of people who expect the situation to unfold the way they've already decided it will. 3 of them. Grady in front on a roan horse, and behind him 2 men that Ronan didn't recognize. One was large, thick through the shoulders, the kind of size that suggests it's been useful in past situations and has therefore been relied upon. The other was younger, leaner, with the particular alertness of someone paid for specific skills rather than general intimidation. The younger one was the problem. Ronan clocked him first and kept him in the peripheral awareness. Grady pulled up 20 yards from the cabin and looked at Ronan standing in the yard with the rifle. He looked like a man arriving at a destination he'd been thinking about for a long time. There was something almost satisfied in his expression. Not happy, exactly, but resolved. The way a man looks when he's finally about to do the thing he's been putting off. Vance, he said. Grady, you've had a comfortable winter, looks like. He looked at the cabin, the lean-to, the woodpile, the cleared yard. His eyes moved the way a man's eyes move when he's cataloging a space for tactical purposes. Cozy setup you've got up here. What do you want? Grady smiled. It was not a good smile. You know what I want. I want what I came to Red Mercy for 6 months ago. The debt's still outstanding. The debtor's wife is still, he looked at the cabin window, presumably still in residence. And the man who interfered with the legal collection proceeding is standing right in front of me. I paid the debt, Ronan said. You took the furs. I took $42 toward what was owed me. The rest, Grady shrugged, theatrical about it, we can discuss. Mrs. Cross and I have an arrangement to finalize. A business arrangement. The boys at the Kingfisher are still interested. The large man behind Grady shifted his weight. The younger one hadn't moved at all. That stillness was deliberate, and it was the most dangerous thing in the yard at this moment. You need to turn around, Ronan said. Take your men and go back down the trail. This is the only time I'll say it. 1 man with a rifle, Grady said, almost pleasantly. And I count 3 of us. Those are interesting odds to be issuing ultimatums from. Turn around, Grady. Grady's pleasant expression didn't shift. He looked at Ronan for a long moment with the look of someone arriving at a decision they'd already made days ago. Then he nodded, not to Ronan, to the men behind him. The large man went for his gun. Ronan brought the rifle up and fired in one motion, the way 11 years of solitary existence in terrain that occasionally required fast, accurate shooting will train a body to move, without the intermediary steps of conscious decision, just the body doing what it had been taught. The large man took the shot in the upper left chest and came off his horse sideways, landing in the mud with the boneless weight of someone who has stopped making decisions about where they fall. The younger man had already moved. Fast. Faster than Ronan had estimated, and he'd estimated fast. He'd gone left off his horse the moment Ronan's rifle came up, using the horse as cover, and he came up with his pistol in the space of 2 seconds and put a shot past Ronan's right ear that was close enough to feel. Ronan threw himself left, behind the woodpile, and worked the rifle's lever action. The mechanism stuttered. He worked it again. Stuck. The action had jammed. The specific, maddening malfunction that happened sometimes in wet weather when the mechanism got debris in it, the thing he'd been scrupulous about preventing all winter, and had apparently failed to prevent this morning. He stripped the round, tried again, still stuck. He had 4 seconds before the younger man repositioned for a clear shot. From behind the woodpile, he couldn't see Grady. That was the second problem. Grady had moved off his horse during the first shot, and Ronan had lost visual on him, which meant Grady was somewhere in the yard that Ronan couldn't see, which was exactly the situation he'd been trying to prevent. The younger man fired again. The shot hit the top log of the woodpile and sent splinters into Ronan's face. He felt the sting of it along his cheekbone, but didn't move. "Come out from behind there, Vance," Grady's voice, from the left, closer than he expected. "Rifle's jammed. I heard it. Come out and we'll—" The cabin door opened. Everything that happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and Ronan remembered it afterward in the way you remember things that occur at the intersection of terror and precision. Each component separately, each one clear, the sequence of them assembling into something almost slow. Evelyn came through the door with the revolver up. Not running, not rushing, walking, the way he'd taught her. Deliberate, weight forward, both hands on the grip, wrist locked. The shoulder would be screaming. He knew the shoulder was screaming because he'd watched her shoot every day for 2 months, and he knew what that recoil did to the damaged joint. None of it was in her face. Grady turned toward her. He had his pistol out. He'd had it out since he came off his horse, which was the part Ronan hadn't been able to see. And he swung it toward her with the mechanical efficiency of a man who has done this kind of thing before and is not particularly troubled by pointing a weapon at a woman. I was 25 feet from her. She was 40 feet from the woodpile where Ronan was pinned. The younger man behind the horse was repositioning, tracking her now instead of the woodpile. Grady said, "Put that down, Evelyn," using her first name, which was deliberate, the presumption of ownership, even now, especially now. "You're not going to—" She fired. The revolver went off with the heavy, concussive report that it always produced. Not the sharp crack of the rifle, but something deeper, more physical, a sound you felt in the sternum. The recoil moved her back half a step. The shoulder took it. She stayed up. Grady went backward off his feet like something had hit him at speed. He came down in the mud and the slush at the edge of the yard, and he came down hard, and he came down still, the way bodies land when the decision has been made before they hit the ground. The younger man had frozen for the half second that Evelyn's shot produced in everyone, that involuntary full-body pause when something large and final happens nearby. And Ronan used that half second to get the jammed round clear of the action and chamber the next one. He came up over the woodpile with the rifle and put the muzzle in the direction of the younger man's face. The younger man looked at the rifle, looked at Grady in the mud, looked at Evelyn, who had the revolver pointed at him now with the same deliberate two-handed grip, the barrel not moving, her feet planted in the wet yard. He put his pistol on the ground very slowly. Then he put his hands up. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ronan had heard in months. He came out from behind the woodpile with the rifle up, keeping the young man in his sights while he crossed the yard. He picked up the dropped pistol and stepped back. The large man was not moving and would not be moving again. Grady was the same. "Back down the trail," Ronan said to the younger man. "Leave the horses. You walk." The man looked at the horses, calculating. "You walk," Ronan said again, with the specific quiet emphasis of someone who is not going to say it a third time. The man walked. They stood in the yard and watched him pick his way down the muddy trail until he was out of sight around the first bend. Whether he kept going all the way to Red Mercy or stopped somewhere on the lower trail, Ronan didn't know. It was a problem for later. He lowered the rifle. He turned to look at her. She was still standing where she'd been when she fired, both feet in the wet mud of the yard, the revolver at her side now, smoke still trailing from the barrel in the cold spring air. She was looking at Grady where he'd fallen, with an expression that was not what Ronan expected. Not relief, not satisfaction, not horror, exactly. It was something more complicated than any of those things. The look of someone who has done something that could not be undone and was in the process of understanding, for the first time in the real way, rather than the theoretical way, what that meant. Her hands started shaking. Not slightly, genuinely shaking. The deep tremor that comes after the body has held itself in check for too long, and has decided the emergency is over, and is now presenting the bill for what that cost. She was aware of it. He could see her become aware of it, could see the moment she registered her own hands moving and didn't know what to do about it. He crossed the yard to her. He took the revolver from her hands, carefully, and broke the cylinder and let the spent cases fall into the mud and set it aside. Then he did the thing that he would not have been capable of doing 6 months ago, before a winter in a 12 by 14 cabin with this woman, before the water hauling and the firewood and the beans and the nightmares in the dark, and 2 months of watching her refuse to stop. He put his hand against the side of her face, briefly, the way you touch something to tell it that it's real. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Then she opened them and stepped back and looked at the yard and said, in a voice that was steadier than her hands, "We need to deal with this before dark." "Yes," he said. "And the horses need to be tied." "Yes." She looked at him. There were things in her expression that were not going to be said right now, that were going to be processed privately, in the way she processed everything, filed and worked over in the quiet hours, until they became something she could carry instead of something that was carrying her. He understood that. He had 11 years of experience doing the same thing. "You're bleeding," she said. He touched his cheek. The splinters from the woodpile. He'd forgotten about them. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," she said. "Let me look at it anyway." He let her. They stood in the mud of the clearing in the thin April sunlight, two people who had come through something together that most people never come through at all. And she picked the splinters out of his cheek with steady hands, and he held still and let her. And the mountain rose above them, indifferent and enormous and enduring, the same as it had always been, the same as it would be long after both of them were gone. They worked through the afternoon without stopping. It was not the kind of work that allowed for pausing and thinking about what you were doing, which was probably a mercy. Ronan brought the 2 horses around to the lean-to and tied them and gave them water because the animals hadn't done anything wrong and didn't deserve to stand thirsty in the yard, while the humans dealt with the consequences of human problems. Evelyn went inside and came back with the 2 lengths of rope he kept coiled on the second shelf and handed one to him without discussion. They did what needed to be done in the practical, methodical way of people who understand that the only way through certain tasks is straight through them, without slowing down enough to feel the full weight of what your hands are doing. The ground was too frozen for proper burial. Even the thaw hadn't reached deep enough yet. So they dragged the bodies to the tree line on the north side of the property, where the terrain dropped away into a rocky draw, a place where the snow still lay heavy and the undergrowth was dense. It was hard work, harder than either of them would have admitted. Evelyn didn't say a word through any of it, and neither did he, and by the time they finished, the light had gone pale and thin in the west, and both of them were breathing hard, and neither of them looked at the other's face. They burned the saddles and the saddlebags in the fire pit behind the cabin. The leather took a long time to catch and longer to burn, and the smell of it was bad, and they stood upwind and watched it, and waited until there was nothing left that would tell a story to anyone who came looking. The guns they kept. Ronan checked them both. A decent revolver from the younger man's holster, a rifle from Grady's saddle scabbard that was better quality than he expected, which told him something about Grady's finances that was no longer relevant to anyone. He cleaned them and oiled them and put them in the chest. 2 more weapons was 2 more weapons. The mountain didn't ask where things came from. The horses were the complicated problem. "We can't keep them here," Evelyn said. She was washing her hands at the water basin, scrubbing them the way you scrub when the dirt you're trying to remove isn't entirely physical. "Someone will come looking eventually. If those horses are here, I know." He'd been turning this over while they worked. "There's a man on the lower trail, Beckwith. He runs cattle in the valley, keeps to himself. I've traded with him." He dried his hands on a rag and looked at the horses through the lean-to door. "I'll take them down tomorrow. Tell him I found them loose on the pass. He won't ask much. And if the younger man talks? When he gets back to Red Mercy. Ronan thought about the man's face when he'd put the rifle on him. The calculation in it, followed by the decision to walk away. He was hired, he said. Hired men who walk away from a job don't generally advertise that they walked away from a job. And Grady doesn't have anyone left to report to. He folded the rag. The constable in Red Mercy answers to the mine company. The mine company is not going to spend money investigating what happened to Silas Grady on a mountain pass on behalf of men who hired out their guns. It's not worth it to them. She turned this over. You sound certain. I'm not certain. I'm calculating probabilities. He looked at her. The probability that anyone in Red Mercy will spend serious effort on this is low. The probability that the hired man will keep his mouth shut to avoid explaining his own part in it is high. A pause. That's not the same as certain. Nothing's certain. She nodded. She understood the difference. She'd always understood the difference. And she didn't ask him to promise her something more than the honest odds. It was one of the things about her that he had stopped noticing because it had become simply part of what she was, the same way the cabin's particular smell or the sound of the creek in the morning had become part of the mountain's baseline. They ate dinner late after dark, both of them moving around the cabin with the slightly mechanical quality of people running on the last of the day's reserves. She made something simple, the dried beans again, with the last of the smoked venison cut thin across the top, and coffee that she made correctly this time, at the strength he preferred, a calibration she'd made sometime in December without commenting on it. He noticed things like that. He noticed more things than he let on. He sat at the table with his coffee and looked at his hands and thought about the day. What struck him, sitting there in the ordinary lamplight of the cabin he'd built and occupied alone for 11 years, was not the violence itself. He'd been in difficult situations before. The mountains had produced their share of them, and he'd produced a few himself, in the years before Black Hollow when he'd been a different and less careful kind of man. What struck him was the door opening. The moment the cabin door had opened and she'd come out into that yard, he'd replayed it multiple times since it happened, the way the mind involuntarily replays the events it hasn't finished processing. Not the shot, the moment before the shot, the deliberateness of her, the way she'd walked across the yard with her weight forward and the revolver up, into a situation where the odds against her were substantial, and she'd walked into it anyway, because the alternative was watching him get killed behind a woodpile, and she had apparently decided that was not an acceptable outcome. You should have stayed inside, he said. She looked up from her bowl. That was the plan, he said. If it went bad outside, you were safer. You were behind a woodpile with a jammed rifle, and Grady had already moved to flank you, she said, with the patience of someone explaining something to a person who already knows they're wrong. If I'd stayed inside, he would have come around the woodpile and shot you at 4 feet. She looked at him steadily. That wasn't a plan anymore. That was a situation. You could have been shot. Yes. She picked up her coffee. So could you. He sat with that. There wasn't much he could do with it because she was right. Tactically, practically, by every measure that mattered in the actual moment, she was right. The plan had stopped being viable when the rifle jammed and Grady left his horse, and she'd made a correct assessment of a changed situation in real time and acted on it. That was not a thing he could argue with. What he couldn't say, what was sitting in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with tactics or probability calculations, was that the 4 seconds between the door opening and the shot had been the longest 4 seconds he'd experienced since Cal went into the snow 11 years ago on the lower ridge, and that the feeling those 4 seconds produced in him was not a feeling he had a ready category for, because he'd spent a decade and more making sure not to be in situations where that particular feeling was possible. He drank his coffee. You were good, he said, which was inadequate but was what he had. She looked at him across the table. Her expression did the thing it sometimes did in private moments. The outer layer of practicality went thin, and something more complicated showed through, not softness exactly, but the suggestion of depth beneath the surface. I was terrified, she said. That's not the same as not good. I know. She set her coffee down. I know that. A pause. My hands didn't stop shaking until about an hour ago. Mine either, he said. She looked at him. He wasn't sure she entirely believed him. That was all right. It was true, but he understood why it might not look that way from the outside, and he wasn't going to work hard to convince her. The shaking had been internal, the kind that doesn't always show on the surface of a man who has spent 11 years building a surface that doesn't show much. But it had been there. They sat together in the quiet for a while, with the stove going and the mountain doing its night sounds outside the walls. And something settled between them that didn't need to be named to be real. The next morning, he took the horses down to Beckwith's place on the lower trail. It was a 4-hour round trip in mud that was getting worse as the melt accelerated, and Beckwith asked exactly one question. These shod recent? And when Ronan said yes, they were, Beckwith looked at him for a moment with the incurious eyes of a man who has lived adjacent to difficult situations long enough to know when information is more trouble than it's worth. "I'll take them," Beckwith said, and that was that. Ronan made the climb back up in the early afternoon, his boots caked with mud to the ankle, and his shoulders tired from the footing, and when he came over the last rise and the cabin came into view. He stopped for a moment the way he had stopped 6 months ago in Henley's general store, noticing something without having planned to notice it. Smoke from the chimney. The lean-to door propped open the way she propped it when she was working inside it. The sound, faint but audible, of the hatchet on wood, the rhythm of it now confident and even, nothing like the tentative chopping of those first autumn mornings. Small things. The ordinary evidence of a place that was occupied and tended and alive. He'd thought about this cabin differently all winter, in ways he hadn't been fully aware of in the moment of thinking. It had stopped being a place of exile somewhere around January, and he hadn't marked the exact date because there was no exact date. It had been a gradual thing, so gradual it was invisible as it happened, like the way the light changes through a winter afternoon, not in any single perceptible increment, but cumulatively, undeniably different from one end to the other. He went inside. The weeks that followed were a different kind of settling. The threat had passed, or had passed enough, in the sense that nothing in life passes completely. And the mountain was moving into the full thaw, the creek running high and loud, the first green things working their way up through the snow's retreat. Ronan's trap lines were productive in spring in ways they weren't in winter, and they fell into a new pattern, slightly different from the winter one, adjusted for the longer days and the changed terrain and the fact that both of them had, without formally acknowledging it, stopped thinking of the cabin as temporary. She had not suggested leaving. He had not suggested she leave. The subject of Red Mercy came up once, in early May, when she mentioned something about the house Thomas's brother had wanted. She thought he'd probably taken possession of it by now, and Ronan said probably, and that was the extent of the conversation. Red Mercy was the past. Both of them were disinclined to revisit the past more than necessary. What replaced those conversations were different ones, practical, mostly, the way most conversations were between people whose daily life was still largely about survival. The trap lines. The supply question. They'd need to go down before high summer to lay in for next winter, a trip that required a certain amount of planning given that neither of them was eager to walk back into a town that might have complicated feelings about what had happened on the pass. Not Red Mercy. There was a trading post 2 days east, Corrigan's, that Ronan had used occasionally, and that wouldn't know either of their faces. "Together?" she said, when he raised it. "I figured we'd go together," he said. "Unless you—" He stopped. He'd been about to say unless you'd rather go alone, and the absurdity of that sentence in this context stopped him partway through. She'd looked at him with a trace of something dry in her expression. "Together," she confirmed. But there were other conversations too, less practical, that arrived in the spaces that the winter's urgency had not allowed for. Spring evenings on the ridge, when the light lasted long enough to sit outside on the bench he'd built against the east wall years ago and watch it go. The sky running through colors that had no names adequate to them. The mountains going from brown to amber to something close to dark violet before the stars came through. She brought her coffee outside on those evenings. He brought his. They didn't always talk. When they did talk, it was often about small things. The animals she'd seen that day on the lower slope, a hawk that had been hunting the field mice in the clearing, the way the creek sounded different from the way it had sounded in November. One evening in late May, she said, "I was thinking about what you told me. About Cal." He looked out at the mountain. "You've been carrying that alone for a long time," she said. "Yes." Is it lighter, talking about it?" He considered this honestly, the way she'd taught him, by example, to consider things, without reaching for the easy answer, without performing either more feeling or less than was actually there. "Some," he said. "It doesn't change what it is. But there's something about saying a thing out loud means it exists outside of you, not just in you." He paused. "I didn't know that before." She looked at him. Neither did I. The evening deepened. Somewhere down the slope, a nightbird started up, the particular call that had become, over the course of the winter, one of the sounds he associated with the end of the day, rather than with any particular feeling about the end of the day. I'm not the same person I was in October, she said. No. I don't know if that's... She stopped, working it out. I don't know if there's a word for whether that's good or bad. It's just what happened. The mountain does that, he said. Takes what you bring up here and does something with it. He looked at his coffee. I don't know if it makes you better. It makes you different. It makes you... He tried to find the word. Strip down. She thought about that. What's left? After you're stripped down. What's actually there, he said, which is either something or nothing, depending on the person. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said quietly, I think you knew there was something there. When you turned around in that store, you looked at me and you turned around and paid the debt. You didn't know me. You couldn't have known me. A pause. So why? He'd asked himself this question, in various forms, across the 7 months since it happened. He'd offered her the honest answer in the dark on their first night. I don't know. And that answer had been true at the time. It was less true now. He'd had a winter to turn it over, and what he'd arrived at was not a neat conclusion, but something more like the outline of one, the shape of a thing seen in low light. I think, he said slowly, that there's a version of myself that stopped looking at people a long time ago. After Cal. It was easier not to look. If you don't look, you don't see anything that makes you feel responsible for it. He set his coffee down on the bench between them. But I looked at you. I don't know why exactly. I looked and I saw someone who wasn't going to show that she was afraid even with a knife in the room, and I thought... He stopped. What? She said. I thought that was a person worth knowing, he said. And then I thought, I haven't thought that about anyone in 11 years. She held that for a long time without speaking. The starfield had opened fully now, the kind of clear, dark sky that the mountains produced in late spring, unpolluted by anything human, the stars dense and cold and indifferent in the best way, the way that makes a person feel small but not alone if they're standing next to the right person. Ronan, she said. Yeah. I'm glad you didn't walk out of that store. He looked at her. She was looking at the stars, her coffee held in both hands, and her profile in the dark was something he knew, the way he knew the ridgeline, thoroughly, without thinking about knowing it, because it had become part of the landscape he navigated by. So am I, he said. They sat there until the cold coming off the upper snowfields made the bench uncomfortable, and then they went inside, and he banked the stove for the night, and she folded the blankets on her sleeping frame, still the wooden frame she'd built that first week, though it had been rebuilt twice with improvements and now bore little resemblance to the original rough construction. He lay on his platform in the dark and thought about the trap lines he'd run tomorrow, and the supply trip they'd need to plan, and the bench on the east wall that needed a new board on the left side where the wood had started to check. Ordinary things. The texture of a life that was not extraordinary by any external standard. No wealth, no comfort, no proximity to anything most people would recognize as civilization, but that had, without his designing it, become exactly the size and shape of what he wanted his life to be. He didn't know what to call what he and Evelyn Cross were to each other. He'd stopped trying to find the right word somewhere around February and had decided that the absence of a precise word was not a problem that needed solving. She was here. He was here. The mountain held them both, and they held each other in the way that people who have been through hard things together hold each other, not with the frantic grip of people afraid of losing something, but with the steady, unspectacular reliability of people who have already proven they'll show up. In a storm, in a jammed rifle, in a general store in October when every other person in the room looked at the floor. He had spent 11 years believing that the best version of solitude was the complete kind. No one to worry about, no one to lose, no one to require anything of him that he might fail to provide. The mountain had seemed to agree with that position. It was, after all, a place that stripped away everything unnecessary and left only what could endure. What he understood now, lying in the dark with the stove ticking and the creek running loud outside the walls, was that he'd been wrong about what was unnecessary. Evelyn's breathing, across the cabin, had the slow rhythm of someone almost asleep. He closed his eyes. Outside, the mountain went on being the mountain, enormous and indifferent and ancient, asking nothing of anyone, caring about nothing, unable to care. And inside the small, ridiculous, moss-roofed, dirt-floored cabin built into its side, two people who had arrived at this place by completely different routes of damage and survival and stubborn refusal to quit